Hi, this is Dr. Duncan Ferguson of the University of Illinois and Vet Med Academy. I'd like to thank my collaborators from the Veterinary Educators and Pharmacology Special Interest Group, Drs. Ormandy, Vendrig, Villar, and Chambers, for without their help, this project would not have been possible. In this series, we hope to introduce you to basically the drug regulations that you might expect to see around key parts of the world. And in doing so, we're going to go have our guests from VEPSIG, basically faculty members from universities in Great Britain, Holland, Colombia in South America, and New Zealand. And in this project, we'll divide our attention logically between companion animals and food animals. And in doing so, we're going to try to highlight the differences that you'd expect in any given country and region in the management of companion animals versus food animals with regards to drug regulations. At the end of each section, I'll summarize what we've highlighted during the discussion. And this first section is going to be on companion animal drug regulation and practice issues around drugs. I hope you enjoy it. Well, Dr. Ormandy, thank you for joining us. And we're going to be discussing the regulatory issues around the use of veterinary pharmaceuticals around the world. And I wondered if you'd tell us a little bit about yourself so we can get an idea where you are and how you got to where you are right now.
Thank you very much, Duncan. So I'm Emma. I am a lecturer in professional and clinical skills at the University of Liverpool. I graduated from Glasgow Vet School in 2008 and then was in small animal practice for a few years until I moved to Liverpool University to do my master's and my PhD, which was on antimicrobial resistance. And then quickly from my PhD, I joined the teaching staff at Liverpool in my current role.
Yes, I'm a veterinarian. I also still work as an equine certified practitioner, mainly in weekends and nights. But the main job I have now is an assistant professor in veterinary pharmacology and toxicology. And I did my PhD projects also in pharmacology, and I specialized. So I'm a member of the European College of Veterinary Pharmacology and Toxicology as well. And I work now mainly in teaching and do some research as well in our department. So involved in the entire curriculum. Perhaps relevant for this is that with regard to antimicrobial use, I am also involved in national guidelines for practitioners. So in several, so for horses, for dairy cattle, for veal calves, for small ruminants, so sheep and goats.
Well, my background is basically as a toxicologist. I did my residency at Iowa State, and then that was almost 20 years ago. So even though I still keep in touch with these guys, you know, I'm not really working as a diagnostician as I was there. I've been in Colombia for about 13 years now. And for the most part, I've been teaching both pharmacology and toxicology. And I've along the way, I have worked in many tropical diseases, if you like, in cattle, the cattle fever tick. I've done a lot of work on that. And lately we've been exploring what's going on in antimicrobial resistance, which is a huge problem, not only in Colombia, but I think everywhere in the world. So
yeah, I'm in Massey University in Palmerston North in New Zealand. I'm originally a British graduate, Bristol University, went out and practice for a few years, various large animal, small animal practice, and then went back to Cambridge University to be an anaesthetist. And I got interested in the pharmacology of anesthetics and analgesic drugs. So I went back to Bristol to do a PhD. And then when I finished my PhD, I worked for a while as a lecturer in Bristol and then came out to Massey as a pharmacologist. So at the moment I do 1 day a week anesthesia and the rest of the time pharmacology. Now, as you can imagine, New Zealand's a pretty small country, so the veterinary pharmacologists are pretty thin on the ground. So I have to be a jack of all trades pharmacologist rather than just analgesic drugs. But most of my research is in analgesics. But I'm also on various official committees like antibiotic resistance committees and so on. Basically, everyone in New Zealand knows everyone else at an official level, so it's a lot of stuff is done informally.
Yeah, so what I wanted to do is to look at both the companion animal and the food animal side of things and see if we could, through examples, elicit how a veterinarian might be more or less constrained by the use of their veterinary pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
And the first clinical scenario I wanted to talk about was a dog. Let's just say it's a 7-year-old miniature poodle with refractory epilepsy. And so to start with, what would drugs in your country or jurisdiction, in the UK, I guess at this point, would be, what drugs would be allowed to be used for starts?
So there's 3 licensed or authorized drugs for treatment of epilepsy in dogs: phenobarbital, potassium bromide, it's sodium bromide in other countries, but potassium bromide for us, and emapitoin is also authorized. Emapitoin is only authorized as a monotherapy. Potassium bromide is only authorized in conjunction with phenobarbital treatment, so not as a monotherapy here.
Yeah, in the US, we hadn't seen it, but emapitoin until recently, it was recently approved.
Oh, okay.
So I personally have very little experience with it. So, but it's like diphenylhydantone, the same kind of class of drugs, and interacts with benzodiazepine receptors.
Yes, yeah.
So if you go down that list, and one of the first line drugs that you mentioned was phenobarbital.
Yes.
If that drug as a monotherapy is ineffective, what generally do you see, and what's allowed, and what's sort of the process and decision making that a pharmaceutical agent is chosen in this situation for companion animals?
So within companion animals in the UK and in food producing animals, we have the cascade. So any authorized product has to be used before we would move to a non-authorized product. So in the case that monotherapy had been started with phenobarbital, commonly it would then be potassium bromide that could be added to that. If it was then refractory, we could consider other drugs. If you were going to consider adding something like emapitoin in, that would then be off license because it's not being used as a monotherapy in that case. So therefore you'd be using it under the cascade, so not strictly what it was authorized for. So that kind of taking a step down in the cascade, what we say is we should be using an authorized product for indicated in the species and condition in Great Britain or UK wide. Obviously, emapitoin is authorized there, but only as a monotherapy. So it would be stepping down the cascade to a veterinary medicine authorized in Great Britain, Northern Ireland, or throughout the UK. Kind of for say, you can either do it for another species for the same condition or a different condition in the same species, but it would come under that loop there because it's slightly different instructions on how you should be giving it. So you would just have to take that step down. And obviously it's really, really important if you're doing anything like this, you're getting client consent for that. Clients should be aware that you're using something off license.
Yeah, in that regard, I was looking at, there was a systemic review of, in fact, from UK and I think EU, Germany, of the anti-epileptic drugs, and they sort of showed it as all the drugs you mentioned so far: phenobarb, imipitoin, bromide, and then down the list, levetiracetam, zonisamide, and other drugs.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the latter two, for example, would be whether they're used doesn't mean they're approved, right?
Yeah, exactly. So basically, as I say, the order we've got to use, and they should be within the we have to split the UK currently into Great Britain and Northern Ireland because Brexit has done that to us, and there are slightly different rules for each. But for within Great Britain, if you don't have an authorised product, then you should look for a product that's authorised in Northern Ireland for the species and condition. If not, then you're looking either UK-wide or in Great Britain or Northern Ireland separately that it's authorised for a different condition in the same species or the same condition in a different species. If you can't do that, that's when we can move on to those other drugs, the human drugs. So those are authorised in humans, so they would just be that next step down. Zonisamide, levetiracetam. Those are the ones that would come after those first three. We're always going to...
Okay. And so the key to using those drugs that are off-label or not on the list would be approval of the owners, that they recognize it's extra label use.
Yes.
And probably making sure that you have good record keeping in case something happens.
Yeah, exactly. I always tend to say to our students, you get consent forms from people, but it's not the consent form that shows that you've got informed consent. It's a conversation that you have and your clinical records that really detail it. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Can you think of any other practical or regulatory limits regarding what this particular use application?
Yeah, I mean, other things to think about are obviously if there's other conditions that are going on that are contraindicated, for example, phenobarbital and hepatic disease. It's because it induces cytochrome P450, there is increased risk of hepatic injury with that drug. So I think just making sure before you start an animal on a drug, because that's what is authorized, just make sure there's no contraindications there with other conditions, for sure.
Good medicine, good pharmacology.
Yes, exactly. I think that's a really important thing for students as well, is don't just read the dosage on the data sheet. When you're looking at a data sheet, please do read it all. There's a reason why all that information is there for you. And in the UK, we have the Veterinary Medicines Directorate have an online database. I'm sure it's very similar in the US of all the authorized drugs. And that's the most up-to-date place to be looking for any changes. So if you're ever unsure, go there, and that's really helpful.
Right, great. You mentioned the difference between just Northern Ireland and the main island, I guess. Basically EU and what's happened with Brexit. Can you generalize some things that are making this complicated right now, and where do you see it going?
Oh, I think at the moment it's all moving, and I think a lot of some things Northern Ireland still is following the EU. So when we talk about food producing animals, there's a list there. I would say at the moment, calling it, there's a lot of debates in Parliament at the moment, and I think trying to call what's going to happen is really difficult. I would just say currently for prescribing, it is just slightly different. If you're going to be using a medicine, for example, that isn't authorised in this case dogs, in Great Britain, Northern Ireland or UK-wide, you then move to human medicine in the UK, but for Northern Ireland, you could do, it must be from another EU member state that you'd have to choose like a drug for animals. So there's more specifics in some ways for Northern Ireland because they are still following some of the EU rules.
I think we have 3 registered drugs for this indication. The one we start normally is phenobarbital. So I don't know if we have to get into doses, regimens, and such, but that's
No,
when
we're
we
just basically
start.
looking at the types of drugs. Yeah.
And of course, you need some time to stabilize concentrations to get the right dose. But then in the end, well, when it works, it works. When it doesn't work, you could add potassium bromide to the phenobarbital, and that's, well, a bit variable, the results with that. And the third we have, if that's not successful, we have it's called imipetrin, so the partial GABA agonist, right? And that's relatively new, and that's, well, expensive, but it has a lot of advantages with regard to side effects, of course. That's the first line treatment of epilepsy, I think. And then we have, of course, some benzodiazepines or other GABAergic pharmaca to give when you have a really a bad seizure, but it's not for a longer duration.
So these three would be and with the adjunct of the benzodiazepines would be accepted as a sort of the tier of drugs that would be chosen first from standpoint of practice and regulatory medicine. Would a vet, say if a vet decided, well, we can get into that in the next step when things aren't working, what it would happen if this drug with say phenobarb and potassium bromide were not effective and you had to go down the list to drugs that were human drugs? What would a veterinarian in the EU be allowed to do?
Well, in this scenario, you would be, I think you would be allowed quite a lot. I'm not sure which specific drugs you're talking about, but if it isn't a problem to give the drugs to an owner that doesn't have the risk of, for instance, the owner taking it himself or abuse or that kind of things. Of course, we have to think about that, but I'm not sure that's for anti-epilepsy drugs. That's often not the case, I think. So I'm not sure. Yeah. So we have drugs that, and I recently looked at a critical review of drugs, and they did include the three that you mentioned. This was a 2014 study out of the EU, including I think Germany and Britain. At the time they were in the EU. And so, you go down from there. They had others, drugs, zonisamide, and you could get into, some people would use other drugs, gabapentin even. Where would the scrutiny come in from the standpoint of regulatory practice? That's a good question.
I think for a vet in the Netherlands.
That's not really, that's not really arranged really well, I think.
Okay.
For some drugs, well, it is like opioids. Those are more restricted by law.
Right.
But gabapentin, for instance, I think a lot of small animal practitioners use gabapentin in dogs and cats for several indications, and that's. Well, it's allowed if you have a good argumentation.
Right. So the point is,
for the cascade, the cascade is in law. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's quite logical.
Yes.
It's a step. It's logical, and human medicine are also a possibility when you have the argumentation. Yeah.
Right, and then you have to have the documentation, right, and then you have to have the veterinary patient client agreements in place, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
That's important.
Are there, so from a practical or regulatory standpoint, there's the cascade, but then there are no real limits as long as you can make a case that it's good practice if you see it in the literature, et cetera.
Yeah. And there should be no risks or for the owner who gives the medication. Exactly. So either with regard to abuse or side effects or risks for the owner, of course. But I don't think that's the case here.
Well, I think it might be different here than it is in other places, but phenobarbital is, is the one that most veterinarians will probably use as a first line of therapy. It can be acquired through a narcotic, through the National Narcotic Agency, which is basically the one regulating all the controlled substances. Phenobarb is one of those controlled substances. So basically what the veterinarian needs is to purchase a prescription pad, and then there's kind of pharmacies that are only authorized to sell those controlled substances. Now, having said that, the truth of the matter is the reality is quite different. I was kind of interviewing a couple of veterinarians, and they say that probably about 80 to 90% of controlled substances are attained through a black market, if you want to call it some way. It's kind of a murky business. You probably don't want to go around poking too much, because as I say, it's all kind of it's probably a mafia-like business in some ways. So basically, all the drugs that are controlled substances, that includes phenobarb. We have ketamine, propofol, opioids. As I say, I was chatting with one of the suppliers, and he says that most of them are coming from Chile these days. And again, it's kind of a win-win situation for everybody here. The veterinarians get those drugs 2 or 3 times cheaper. Then you have 50% of the population which is informal jobs. So there are probably a lot of vendors or suppliers that are taking advantage of that. And the regulatory agencies, they probably look, the other way. They don't really want to they don't really want to crack down on that business.
So let's go on to the next phase of this, and let's say that animal is not responding well to phenobarb, and you need to get into other drugs. First of all, what drugs would be available? How would they get them? What do you think would happen there?
I was checking with, as I say, a few veterinarians that I work with because they're interested on doing some research, and they say that most of the other drugs that you might use can be easily attained through most pharmacies. So which ones would those be? Potassium bromide, Keppra,
Tiracetam, yeah,
pregabalin, gabapentin. So if you want to use those as an adjunct, to phenobarb, you can find those easier than phenobarb. So,
yeah, and when I visited South America and actually Colombia, you notice pharmacies on a lot of places. There's a lot of small pharmacies, so that's presumably where they go to at that point. Yeah. Okay. So would there be any practical? What are the most common practical reasons for going beyond what we just talked about, or even going to that level for veterinarians in Colombia? Is it cost? Is it regulations? Availability of drugs? What do you think?
Yeah, well, probably most veterinarians don't want to go through the hassle of registering with the National Narcotic Agency. They have to pay for the the prescription pad or notebook, whatever you want to it's called. And as I say, they can get the controlled substances for a much lower price than if they go through the legal route. So they say there are no really regulatory limits because everything is kind of,
so you don't think the enforcement, there's not enforcement
No.
that you've been able to discern?
No,
Okay,
the
that's obviously an issue.
The veterinarians they talked to, they didn't say that, the regulatory agency, is really, it doesn't show up to the to the clinics.
So you want to give us an overview of how the regulatory scene looks, say compared to what you know about the rest of, let's say UK, for example, or EU?
Yeah, the New Zealand has got some strange quirks here. So basically, the human medicine scene is almost entirely cut and paste from the British legislation. So the Medicines Act and the Misuse of Drugs Act are very, very similar to British before EU days. Veterinary medicines are controlled under a separate act, which wasn't really thought through at the time. So there's a lot of grey areas and a lot of areas where people make policy. Now, the vets in New Zealand are regulated by the Veterinary Council, and they've got a very comprehensive bit in their guide to professional conduct, which sets out the expectations for vets, and that fills in a lot of the gaps in the law. So basically, the law is pretty permissive as long as it relies on vets using their discretion to do things properly.
So in the United States, for example, as long as there's identified on a particular companion animal basis, there's the veterinary patient-client relationship in there. Veterinarian has some leeway, is what you're indicating, with regards to making best evidence decisions.
Yeah, so the animal has to be under the care of the vet, and that for companion animal that would mean having seen the animal, done an examination, and made a decision about what the best treatment is. Now, the best treatment is left pretty well up to the vet. There are some guidelines, but they're fairly vague, and vets can overrule them if they've got a good excuse. So, for instance, the more likely there is to be a problem, for instance, want to use some reserved antibiotics or something like that, you'd have to have a very good justification. But as long as you've got that justification, you can do it. Now, that's actually, vets have got more leeway in New Zealand than human general practitioners have. So they have to refer those sort of cases to an infectious diseases specialist in the hospital, whereas vets can just try and obtain the drugs and give them to animals if they can justify it.
Right. It sounds more like the United States from the standpoint of the freedom to make the decision if you can provide the evidence, or you can show. It doesn't even have to be the kind of evidence that you and I as pharmacologists sometimes accept. It just simply has to be out there and being used by, you can demonstrate it's being used. That seems in distinction is what we heard from our colleague in UK, for example, where there's a hierarchy of choices for certain indications.
We've got a watered down version of the cascade system, but it's much more open. So a lot more is left to the vet's discretion in our version. Okay.
Well, let's talk about the specific scenarios that I forwarded to you. The first being a small animal one, which is sort of initially starts as a routine treatment of 7-year-old miniature poodle with epilepsy.
Well, again, most vets would not start at the best place from a legal point of view. So there are really only 2 anticonvulsants registered for veterinary use in New Zealand. That's imipitone and diazepam. Now, obviously, diazepam wouldn't be suitable for chronic use. Now, imipitone is very expensive here. So most vets will actually use human phenobarb off-label. The cascade system says if there is a veterinary product available which meets the animal's treatment needs, then vets should use it, but it doesn't insist that vets have to use it. So as long as vets can come up with a reason why they should use phenobarb rather than imipitone, they're not allowed to just say it's cheaper, so I'm going to use it because it's cheaper. So they've got to come up with some sort of scientific reason. And I said most animals would probably start off on phenobarb and then get put onto an epitone if the phenobarb doesn't work properly.
So let's say this animal has some refractory condition. Where does a veterinarian, where are they allowed to go in terms of choosing drugs that aren't on those two, amongst those two?
Well, all of the other ones are human drugs. So there's a fair selection in New Zealand. The current trendy one at Massey is the veteracetone. It's quite expensive, and again, it's basically human drug being used off-label. Now, the Medicines Act here allows vets to prescribe human drugs for animals under their care, so it's not a huge problem. But as I say, the Veterinary Council says we should apply the cascade, but if the animal hasn't responded to an epitone properly, then vets can pretty well do what they want. Now, some vets will use bromide as well, but bromide is not available either in human or veterinary form. So vets have to compound it themselves, which raises a whole other legal questions.
So a brief summary of the drug regulations for companion animal medicine around these selected countries around the world. The UK regulations prescribe specific and comprehensive cascade of approved drugs that are allowed for use, and then allow drugs approved for same species, different condition, or different species, same condition, before moving on to what they consider broader extra label use. The European Union requires veterinary approved drugs first within the country, then a choice is possible from veterinary approved drugs in other EU countries before off-label use, which has to be highly documented. In New Zealand, the cascade system is a little looser, with veterinary drug acts outlining something looser than the United Kingdom, allowing best evidence justification of off-label use of human drugs. And in Colombia, the veterinary drug use is less restricted by enforcement and impacted by the common extra legal practice of importation of veterinary drugs from other countries.